everyone. My name is Yair, and today I'm going to show you how I managed to turn EDRs into malicious wipers using zero-day vulnerabilities. I named this research Aikido, and I'll soon explain exactly why. So, as I mentioned, this is me. I'm a security researcher in SafeBreach. I'm 23 years old, and I've been in the cybersecurity industry for around 5 years now. I've started my way in the IDF. I've done a lot of Linux and embedded research, along with some Android research as well. And for the last 2 years, I've been experiencing a lot of Windows internals research in SafeBreach, and I really enjoy it so far. But what are we going to talk about today? So I will start with presenting you my initial thought when I started this research, my initial research goal. Then we'll talk a bit about wipers in general. We'll see what they are, how do they work, and what they're used for. Then we'll deep dive into the technical aspects of the research process itself and see how I managed to find zero-day vulnerabilities that allowed me to create the next generation Aikido wiper. So, as I just mentioned, my initial research goal was to create some sort of a next-generation wiper. But in order to do that, I first needed to understand exactly how wipers work nowadays. So let's talk a bit about wipers in general. And the first thing that I did, of course, when I started this, is that I went to Wikipedia to see what's the actual definition of a wiper. And when I looked up in Wikipedia, I saw that according to Wikipedia, a wiper is a device used to remove rain, snow, ice washer fluid, water, or debris from a vehicle's front window. But that is not the wiper that we're going to talk about today. And we're going to talk about the wiper malware. And according to Wikipedia, again, in computer security, a wiper is a class of malware intended to erase the hard drive of the computer it infects, maliciously deleting data and programs. Now, I'm sure that's no surprise to any of you if you came here, but I just wanted to make this clear. But what are wipers? Why are wipers even used? So, they are mainly used for some kind of offensive acts. So let's say a war. And a very good example for a war that we currently see is the war between Russia and Ukraine. So in the attachments I added here, we can see that both Russia and Ukraine were attacked by wipers recently. And we can also see that both Iran and Israel were attacked by wipers. And so basically everything that we hear on the news about rivalry between countries is also expressed in the cyber warfare. But let's start talking about the technical aspects of how wipers nowadays works. So, I know that many of you probably, once you hear the word wiper, you also think about the word deletion. But there is actually a crucial difference between the two. So let's take a look at the default deletion process in Windows to understand that. Let's say that a certain process calls the delete file API function for a certain file. Then this function asks the kernel to delete that file, and then the kernel goes to a certain place that is called the MFT, which stands for the master file table in the NTFS file system. And there the kernel just marks a certain entry as free. Now this entry is just a pointer to the actual file content, and so the actual file content is not really being erased. So that is the difference between a wipe and a deletion. When we wipe something, it means that we also really make it not restorable, and we actually erase the file content. Now, a deletion can be escalated to a wipe, and that is because once MFT entries are marked as free, then they may be reused again. So when we create a new file, it can potentially receive the free MFT entry, and then when we write that file, then the new content that we write overwrites basically the content which was left on the disk after the file was deleted. But when I tried to understand how do wipers nowadays overcome this gap between deletion and wipe, I saw that a lot of them do not actually delete files. Instead, they just go ahead and straight overwrite the files that they want to wipe. By that, they make sure that the actual file content is being erased and replaced, and by that, wiped and unrestorable. And we can see that really we know a lot of wipers, a lot of famous wipers, some from the very recent years that are using this technique. And so that's something that now exists out there in the wild. And of course, this technique requires admin privileges because when a wiper runs, it probably wants to wipe some files that an unprivileged user cannot access, such as file in the default libraries of the administrator or system files and so on. Another technique that we see in the wild in a lot of wipers is the drive destruction technique. This technique basically means that the wiper writes to the physical hard drive, and by that it can overwrite the MBR, it can overwrite structures that belong to the NTFS file system or file contents. And we can also see again that a lot of famous wipers are using this technique, and again, wipers from the very recent years. And this technique also, of course, requires admin privileges because no unprivileged user should be able to ruin the disk in such a way. But I do want you to notice something important that I noticed after I got to know these techniques or any other technique that a wiper uses. And that is that each of these techniques are obviously initiated by the process of the wiper itself. So that means that if, for example, we have a certain wiper that uses the file overwrite technique, then we can just open up proc1 and we'll see that there's a process that opens and writes to a lot of files. Now, this got me thinking, and I thought to myself, what if I could create some sort of a next generation wiper that would be able to wipe all of these files without calling these obvious API calls? And what if this very same wiper would also be able to do all that as an unprivileged user? This got me thinking about Aikido. Aikido is a martial art that specializes in using the power of the opponents against them. But why is that even relevant for this talk? It's relevant because EDRs have a very special superpower. And this superpower is the ability to delete any file on the system, no matter the privileges required to delete that file. And EDRs must have this ability because potentially any file on the system can be malicious. But before we understand how exactly we're going to Aikido EDRs and antiviruses into deleting target files for an unprivileged user, we first must understand when do EDRs even choose to delete or quarantine a certain file. So on most EDRs that I researched, I saw that, of course, it depends on the configuration, but the most default configuration that I saw was that EDRs choose to delete surely malicious files that they detect automatically. So some EDRs detect these files when they are open. Sometimes some EDR detect these files when they are closed after they were read into, and mostly most EDRs suggest an option for a scan, whether it's a custom scan or just a general system scan. So, with that said, we can start thinking about how we're going to Aikido the EDRs to delete our own target files. And a very crucial thing to understand at that point is that even as an unprivileged user, we still have a certain amount of control over the EDR. And that is because as an unprivileged user, we are able to create a malicious file. And so we are triggering the EDR to delete that file. And all that we are left with at this point is that we somehow still need to trigger the deletion for the wrong file. So, of course, the first idea that popped up in my head was that I should just maybe write some malicious content to an innocent file and then wait for the EDR to delete it. But, of course, this is very problematic because a lot of files that I will want to delete require privileges that, as an unprivileged user, I don't have. And using this idea also, it seems very similar to the file override technique if we look at the API calls. So I needed to think of another idea, and the second idea was that I should probably just somehow point the EDR towards a different path to delete, while it still thinks that it deletes the original path. These vulnerabilities are usually achieved using links. And in the cybersecurity industry, we are familiar with a lot of link vulnerabilities. That is not something new. And this category is called CWE59. And we know so much vulnerabilities of that type that Microsoft has realized that they, of course, need to have a special user right for creating a symbolic link. And that user right is called the Create Symbolic Links user right. And the only users that get this permission by default are administrators. But what was surprising for me is that if we'll think about the difference between a junction point, which is another type of link that we can create on the NTFS file system, then there is actually no difference at all in a high-level perspective between a junction point and a local directory symlink. So I realized that if I want to do something as an unprivileged user, I should probably use junctions. But even knowing that I'm going to use junctions, I still needed to understand when exactly is my window of opportunity to use them and exactly how am I going to use them. And two very important events to understand in the process of malicious file deletion by the EDRs are the time in which the file is being detected as malicious and the time in which the file is really being deleted. So if maybe I will be able to do something with a junction between these two events, I will maybe be able to point the EDR or the antivirus towards a different path. These kind of vulnerabilities are usually called TOCTO vulnerabilities, which stands for time of check and time of use, or in this case, something more suitable would be time of check and time of deletion. And here in this example, we can understand how we can potentially point a privileged program using a junction point towards a different path to delete. So let's say that we're running as an unprivileged user, and we want to delete the endis.sys file. This file is a driver in the operating system, and it's contained inside C, Windows, System32 drivers. So if we can create a specially crafted path, which is very, very similar to the path that we want to delete, just with one main difference, that is that that temp directory that you see there, and we created it as an unprivileged user, so it's under our control, and we just created an endis file in the deepest folder, which is drivers. So if we can potentially cause a privileged program, in our case it's the EDR or the antivirus, to try and delete this path, but then just right before the deletion, we can delete everything from the temp directory, make it to be a junction towards the C drive, then the same path that the EDR is trying to delete actually leads to the original endis.sys file. So that is exactly what I tried to do. I knew that Mimikatz is a file that the EDR wants to delete. And so I created Mimikatz in the path ctemp Windows System32 drivers endis.sys. Then right after the creation, I deleted the file with the temp directory, created a junction instead, and waited for the EDR to delete my target file. But that did not work, and I had a few failed attempts with this method. And the two primary behaviors that I saw were that some EDRs just had a very good grip on the file once I created it, and I was not able to delete the file, and so I was also not able to delete the temp directory and make it to be a junction. And the other behavior that I saw was that some EDRs just gave up on the deletion once I deleted the malicious file because they understood that there is no longer a threat. So at that point, I understood that I probably somehow need to change a bit my window of opportunity or expand it somehow. And what I thought about was that I maybe should force the EDRs and the antiviruses to be forced to do a reboot. Now, as you probably know, when we create or open a file in Windows, we need to give the file sharing mode. So all I did was just to create the Mimikatz file without the file sharing mode flags, while still keeping the file open. And then the EDR started to pop up messages that tell me that I need to reboot my computer in order to fully remediate the threat. So let's see how they do that. Some EDRs use the default Windows API for postponing a deletion. Some other, and a good example for an EDR that does it is Sentinel-1. And some other EDRs just implement this feature by their own. So that means that they keep a list of the paths to delete after the reboot somewhere, and then after the reboot, they just delete these files. But if we'll talk about the Windows API for postponing deletion of a file to after the next reboot, which is done via calling the moveFileEx function with the flag moveFile delay until reboot. And by the way, this flag requires administrator privileges. It requires these privileges because when you call this function with this flag, then this function goes to a certain registry value that is called the pending file rename operations. In this value, it just adds a certain path to delete after the reboot. And then Windows automatically, when it boots after the reboot, it deletes all the paths that are contained inside of this registry value. But the most surprising thing that I saw in this feature when I tried to combine it with the previous method that we talked about is that pending file rename operations blindly follows junctions. And so do other self-implementations of EDRs and antiviruses. So overall, this has led me to create one complete process that I could delete almost any file that I want on the system. And this process was created after I combined the method that I talked about earlier with creating a junction between these two events and forcing a reboot. So overall, if we'll take a look at the previous example with the ndis.sys file, in order to achieve a deletion of the original ndis.sys file, what we need to do is to create the path ctemp Windows System32 drivers ndis.sys, then hold the handle to the ndis.sys file that we created, and force the EDR to postpone the deletion to after the next reboot. Then, when the EDR gave up, we can delete the ctemp directory with the Mimikatz file inside, and instead create the junction towards the C drive, reboot the computer, and the ndis.sys file will be gone. By that, we've achieved our two what-ifs in the beginning, and any edge cases that you come up with after noticing that will be answered in the rest of the talk. So overall, this has led me to find 4 different 0 days in 6 different vulnerable products. The products are Microsoft Defender, Defender for Endpoint, Sentinel-1 EDR, Trend Micro Apex One, Avast Antivirus, and AVG Antivirus. Now, if we'll take a look at Gartner's graph on the right for the endpoint protection platforms in 2021, we'll see that actually 3 out of the 5 vendors that I just listed, are high up in the leader square, so that's also huge. And these are the CVEs. So far, I got 3 CVEs for the 6 vulnerable products. Microsoft said that the Defender products are using the same engine, so it's the same code which is vulnerable. That is true for Avast and AVG as well. They have a mutual vendor which is Gen. And Sentinel-1 did send me a fixed version to test, but I was currently unable to get a response from them about the CVE number or the fixed version. And I do need to give a little disclaimer about the Windows Defender vulnerabilities, and that is that I was not able to do arbitrary file deletion against Windows Defender or Defender for Endpoint, but I was able to achieve arbitrary directory deletion. And as we know, a wiper does not really care about deleting a few extra files on the way, so that was not a major issue for my wiper. And now to the first ever demo presented in public with this vulnerability against the Windows Defender antivirus. This demo includes an attempt of deletion of all the drivers from the drivers directory running as an unprivileged user. We will not see the wiper running yet, but we will have another demo with the demonstration of the wiper itself. So let's take a look. So here we can see all the drivers in the drivers directory. They just exist there. Now, we can see that I'm running as a user called Limited. And Limited belongs to the regular unprivileged users group. Now we are creating this specially crafted path, temp Windows System 32. And inside, we're creating a malicious file named drivers, and we are keeping the handle to it open. Now we're asking from Windows Defender to scan that path just to rush the process, and then remove the file. Windows Defender tries to delete that file, and soon it will give up. You can see it gave up. And now we're safe to close the handle, delete the temp directory, and instead create the junction. Now we can reboot the computer, and let's see what happens. So we can see that most of the drivers are gone because Windows Defender iterated through all the drivers until it encountered a driver which was probably open and it could not be deleted. And so it stopped at that point, and on the next reboot, we can see that the operating system is no longer bootable. Thank you. So this exploit is effective against another scenario in which we want to bypass a ransomware protection feature, which is called the controlled folder access. Basically, this feature prevents untrusted processes from modifying or deleting any file that is contained inside one of the protected folders. But if we are causing the most trusted entity on the system, whether it's Windows Defender or other EDR antiviruses products, to delete these files or directories, then the control folder access is not going to stop them from doing that because they are the most trusted process on the system. So again, this exploit is relevant to bypass this feature as well. Overall, I tested 11 different products, and 6 of them were vulnerable. So that means that more than 50% of the tested products were found vulnerable. And not only that, I was just unable to force the other products to postpone the deletion to after the next reboot. So if you find a way to do that, I guess they will probably be vulnerable too. So I really encourage you to try and find more vulnerabilities of that kind before real attackers do. And now to the actual Aikido tool we've been waiting for. So I implemented it just for Sentinel-1, Defender, and Defender for Endpoint, just because they were the most consistent with the exploit and easiest to implement. All I needed is just a POC. The wiper is able to make the system unbootable, just like we saw in the previous demo. The wiper is fully undetectable because, again, it deletes files on the system using the most trusted entity on the system, which is, in our case, the EDR or the antivirus. And the EDR or the antivirus is not going to prevent itself from deleting any file. And in order to minimize the noise of the creation of a malicious file, the wiper also uses ACAR, which is a test file, which is not really malicious, in order to execute the exploit. And that works the same. As we saw, the wiper is also able to run as an unprivileged user. And the wiper, of course, is able to wipe important data on the computer. And we'll soon see a second demo, as I promised you, with the wiper itself running against the Sentinel-1 EDR with an attempt of deleting a whole administrator directory running as an unprivileged user. But if you remember, in the beginning of the talk, I mentioned that there is actually a crucial difference between a deletion and a wipe. So I still needed to overcome this gap somehow. And basically what I did is that I just implemented a feature in the wiper that after the exploits are exploited and the reboot occurs, then the wiper fills up the disk to no space with random bytes for a few times. And by that, the wiper makes sure that the file contents which were left on the disk are overwritten. And I also try to find two popular tools online to do file recovery in order to make sure that this feature actually works. So I try to run the wiper without testing the file recovery. I try to, test the wiper without implementing this feature and then test the file recovery tools. And they were able to recover some of the files, but after implementing this feature, they were not able to recover any file whatsoever. And I'm sure you also asked yourself, but what about the quarantine directory? What if the default configuration is to move the files to the quarantine directory? So in this case, the wiper is also able to mark the quarantine directory for deletion, and the EDR is not able to quarantine the quarantine folder, so it's deleted as well. And regarding the code of the repo itself, I didn't write it like a buggy script, so I really want you to download it, learn from it, expand it, find more vulnerabilities before real attackers do. So I invested a bit of time in the design and documented all the functions, so you really have my invitation to download the repo, use it, and again, find more vulnerabilities. You can have a moment to scan the QR code or take a picture of the link. The repository is currently private, but it will be published today after the talk. So I'll just give you another moment. OK. So here is the second demo that I promised you with the attempt to delete a whole administrator directory running as an unprivileged user with the wipers. Let's take a look. So here we are logged in as admin, and we can see that the administrator has a lot of files and its default libraries. You can see that this is really the admin, and this admin user belongs to the privileged administrator group. Now we're switching to a user named Limited again. So yeah, this is Limited. And Limited belongs again to the unprivileged users group. Now we are running the wiper with the mode of proxy deletion with the request of deleting all user data of the user admin. Now we can see that the admin directory exists in the user's directory. And after running the wiper marks the quarantine and the admin directory for deletion, reboots the computer, exploits the right vulnerability for the EDR that is installed, and then after the reboot, we can see that the admin directory is missing from the user's directory, and the disk is starting to fill up with random bytes. And just to finish, I wanted to show you in Task Manager that the wiper really runs after the reboot. So we can see that it was started silently. Yeah. Okay, so to sum it all up, today we learned that a wiper can be much, much more dangerous if it uses the most trusted entity on the system to do its malicious actions by proxy. In our case, it's the EDR or the antivirus. Now, for these 1,000 times, having security controls does not mean that you are secure. So please keep that in mind every day when you're trying to secure your organization. Lastly, security controls might also be a very preferred target for an attacker because they have very high privileges and very high trust level. Now, I do have 2 vendors' responses in here. I won't read them. Of course, because they're loud, but they are in the presentation, so you can later download the presentation and see the comments if this is interesting for you. Overall, they were very cooperative, and I thank them for that. There were no issues. These are the versions that you need to update to in order to be safe. So you can see Microsoft and Avast and AVG, it's a version. Trend Micro, it's a patch. And Sentinel-1 did send me a fixed version to test, but I was still unable to get a response from them regarding the specific number of the fixed version. I want to thank Shmuel Cohen, which is a team member of mine, for the assistance with testing my different exploits against other EDRs. And basically, this is it. We can move on to the Q&A session.
Thank you.
So you have 2 microphones you can use if somebody would like to ask questions. So this is it. No questions. Okay. So we're done.